General Hospital spoilers for Wednesday, July 9th teased that in the suffocating silence that followed Daisy's disappearance, Michael found himself in a state he had never truly known before, one that teetered dangerously between desperation and paralysis. The air inside the house felt thinner, heavier, as if the very walls had absorbed Sasha's screams and sorrow, her breathless sobs echoing like the ghosts of promises they had made to protect their child at any cost. And now, that cost had come calling. Daisy was gone. No ransom note. No sign of forced entry. No witnesses. Only absence, and the chilling reality that someone had quietly taken the most innocent piece of their world and vanished without a trace. Sasha was falling apart in front of him. Her grief wasn't theatrical, it was terrifying. Her fingers trembled as she clutched Daisy's last worn blanket, her nails digging into the fabric like she could squeeze their daughter back into existence. Her voice, hoarse from shouting, had begun to collapse into a silent terror, and her eyes, red, glassy, wild, searched Michael's face for reassurance, for any signal that he had a plan, that there was still hope. And Michael, broken as he felt, did what he had to do. He became still. Strong. Steady. He pulled Sasha into his arms, wrapped her tight, and whispered over and over, "We're going to get her back. I swear to you, we will find her." He didn't know where those words were coming from, he had no evidence, no strategy yet, no leads, but he knew that if he didn't become that anchor in that moment, Sasha would drown in panic. And he couldn't afford to lose both of them. But behind the calm, Michael was unraveling. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. Michael's mind, honed by months of custody battles, betrayals, legal traps, and emotional warfare, immediately began piecing together what this really was, a message. Someone was sending a statement. And Daisy had become the vessel. Every protective measure he had put in place, the cameras, the guards, the routines, had failed. And that failure cut deeper than any wound ever could. He could barely breathe beneath the weight of it. Because in trying to protect Wiley and Amelia from court battles, and Sasha from collapsing under pressure, he had shifted his eyes away from the one thing he should never have looked away from. Daisy. This was an adjustment. A terrifying, permanent shift in the game. The stakes were no longer just about parental rights or power or courtrooms, they were about survival. And the fear that now lived in Michael's chest wasn't ordinary. It had become obsession. Obsession with retracing every second. Obsession with reviewing every security feed, every phone call. Every strange face in the background of every photograph taken in the last week. Obsession with who had access, who had motive. And who knew Daisy's routine intimately enough to take her without leaving a single trace of chaos behind. Sasha had barely spoken since the initial police sweep. She had collapsed in Michael's arms and, between broken sobs, managed only one question, why Daisy? And Michael couldn't answer. Not yet. But he had a theory. One that chilled him more deeply than any cold case or courtroom verdict. He believed someone was trying to punish him. That someone had calculated the perfect way to shatter him from the inside out, by taking the one part of his life he had thought was still untouched by the cruelty of his world. Daisy was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be the bright light born out of darkness, the healing bond between two people who had known more pain than most families could imagine. Sasha had nearly died to bring her into the world. Michael had nearly destroyed himself trying to protect her from the backlash of Nina, of Drew, of the court's judgment. And now, she was gone. And the only thing left in her place was an unbearable silence that seemed to mock every promise he had made. But even as grief clawed at the edge of his mind, Michael knew he couldn't afford to fall. Brick had already mobilized his network. Jason was reaching out to his underground contacts. The PCPD, while making a public effort, had already started asking if this was a custody-related kidnapping, an assumption that only infuriated Michael further. He didn't believe this was about custody. He believed this was about control. About power. About revenge. And one name kept surfacing in the back of his mind, Sidwell. The same man who had orchestrated Natalia's downfall. The same man who had planted moles in Sunny's organization. The same man who had nearly killed Christina in a fire and then quietly disappeared behind a wall of influence and untouchable connections. Sidwell knew how to create chaos without ever appearing at the scene. And now, Michael feared he had turned his attention toward him and Sasha. It made sense. Targeting Daisy would destabilize everything. It would reignite trauma in Sasha, turn Michael's focus away from legal battles, and fracture the fragile alliance between Sunny's remaining allies. It would set the Corinthos family on fire from the inside, and Sidwell would never need to raise his voice. As Michael watched Sasha finally slip into a shallow, haunted sleep, her body still trembling, he stood over their daughter's crib, now painfully empty. He placed his hand on the edge and closed his eyes, allowing himself one single moment to feel the weight of it all. The fear. The guilt. The rage. And then he made a silent vow, whoever took Daisy, whoever orchestrated this, would pay. Not in courtrooms. Not with lawyers. But with consequences that couldn't be erased. This wasn't just about finding his daughter. This was about taking back control. About becoming the version of himself he had resisted becoming for years, the man capable of doing whatever it took to protect what was his, no matter how dark the path became. The man who would not hesitate, who would not doubt, who would not wait for justice. Daisy was out there. Somewhere. And Michael was no longer just her father. He was the storm coming for the people who took her. Rick extended an invitation to Liz that at first seemed harmless, maybe even sentimental. But beneath the surface was something far more volatile and insidious. This wasn't just a reunion, it was the revival of a dangerous emotional entanglement that Liz had worked hard to escape. Rick's intentions were clear, he wasn't just trying to make amends, he wanted to reclaim something he believed still belonged to him, Liz's affection, her vulnerability, her trust. But Liz had long since moved on, or so she thought, and now his sudden reappearance was destabilizing the very foundation she had built to protect herself. What began as a single message soon became an onslaught of carefully timed gestures, cryptic words, and unsettling familiarity. Flowers arrived at her door. Texts filled with phrases he used to whisper when they were together. Invitations disguised as kindness but carrying a sharp undercurrent of possessiveness. The man who once deceived her was now presenting himself as reformed, wounded, and misunderstood, but Liz could feel it in her gut, this was no apology tour. This was a reclamation. A reassertion of emotional power. Rick wasn't seeking forgiveness. He was staging a comeback. And Liz was once again being forced into the center of a storm she never invited. The pressure built quickly. Rick was polite in public, charming in front of mutual acquaintances, but when they were alone, his eyes said something different, something darker. His voice softened. But the subtext was aggressive. It wasn't long before Liz began questioning her own judgment. Was she overreacting? Was Rick really dangerous again, or was she just haunted by old trauma? But deep down, she knew this wasn't paranoia. This was instinct. She had seen this version of Rick before, calculated, obsessive, and unwilling to accept rejection. Every time she refused an invitation, he grew colder. Every time she distanced herself, his messages became more pointed. The lines between past and present began to blur. And Liz started to feel that same old trap closing around her again. Her sleep became restless. Her focus at work slipped. She grew short with her children, withdrawn from friends. Haunted by the growing realization that Rick wasn't just manipulating her, he was unraveling her sense of control. And worst of all, she felt alone. Because Rick knew how to play the victim to everyone else. He knew how to appear sincere, how to spin his own narrative. He painted Liz as the one who couldn't let go of the past, the one who was cold, unforgiving, unyielding. Meanwhile, he painted himself as the man who had changed, who only wanted another chance. But Liz remembered too much. She remembered the lies, the betrayals, the fear. And though she had tried to lock that part of her life away, Rick had found a way back in, not with force, but with familiarity. That made him all the more dangerous. Her mind was spinning. Her emotions tangled in contradiction, anger at herself for responding at all, confusion over why part of her even cared, dread over what Rick might do next. She knew she had to draw a line. But the problem with Rick was that he didn't respect lines. He erased them. He redrew them. He crossed them. And now, Liz was trapped in a psychological maze where every path led back to a man who refused to let her go. The world around her began to take notice. Finn was the first to see her distraction. Portia grew concerned about her sudden withdrawal. Even Laura, ever watchful, asked if Liz was all right. But how could she explain it? How do you tell people that someone you once loved was quietly tightening the noose around your life again? That the nightmare had returned not with violence, but with a smile? Rick's obsession was growing, and with it, Liz's fear. Not just for herself, but for the people she loved. Because Rick was unpredictable, and desperation makes dangerous men even more unhinged. The situation had spiraled beyond awkward reunions and uncomfortable texts. This was a psychological invasion. A mental siege. A war being waged inside her home, inside her heart, inside her mind. And she knew, if she didn't act soon, she might lose herself completely. Felicia's revelation to Curtis marked a seismic shift in the unfolding storm that had consumed their lives for months. The very mention of Jacinda's name reopened wounds long cauterized by suspicion, betrayal, and the gnawing frustration of unanswered questions. For weeks, Felicia had been moving quietly. Threading through half-truths, misdirection, and phantom leads in her search for the one person whose testimony could unravel the carefully spun lies that Drew had built his false reputation on. Jacinda wasn't just a ghost from the past, she was the gatekeeper to a truth so volatile it could detonate the entire web of manipulation surrounding not only Curtis and Portia's strained marriage but also the increasingly twisted custody battles that had turned the Corinthos family into a battleground. When Felicia finally sat down across from Curtis, her expression alone warned him that the information she was about to share would change everything. Her voice was steady but heavy with the burden of knowledge. She had found Jacinda. Not a rumor. Not a whisper. But the real woman, alive, isolated, and afraid, hiding not from the public, but from Drew. She had disappeared not by choice, but under pressure. Silenced by threats Curtis had long suspected but could never prove. Jacinda had been Drew's liability, and for good reason. She had witnessed the manipulation firsthand. She had seen him orchestrate narratives behind the scenes, exploit Portia's fears, turn Willow's insecurities into weapons, and even plant doubts in Michael's mind during his most vulnerable moments. What Jacinda carried was not just anecdotal evidence, she had documentation, recordings, and messages that outlined a pattern of coercion, intimidation, and emotional control that Drew had used to climb back into power and secure custody leverage over Amelia and Wiley. Curtis's heart pounded not just from the magnitude of the truth but from what it meant strategically. Felicia's find gave him the upper hand, a weapon Drew would never see coming. But it also came with a risk. The moment Jacinda's existence was confirmed, she would become a target. Drew would stop at nothing to either silence her permanently or discredit her before she could speak. Curtis knew he had to act quickly. Felicia, who had kept Jacinda's location secret even from Anna and Jason, was already drawing up plans for safe extraction. But they both understood that time was slipping through their fingers like sand in a storm. One misstep could cost them not just their shot at exposing Drew, but Jacinda's life. Meanwhile, the revelation weighed heavily on Curtis emotionally. He had always feared that Portia's loyalty was split, not just between him and Drew, but between truth and survival. Now, with Jacinda's testimony imminent, the masked Drew war was about to crack, and it would force Portia to confront every compromise she had made in silence. Felicia's update was more than just a development. It was a spark to a fuse that would ignite a wave of reckoning across Port Charles. Every alliance Drew had built on the back of lies would be tested. Jason and Anna, who had grown increasingly suspicious, now had the missing link to tie Drew's manipulations to the custody wars, to the falsified medical reports, and possibly even to the mysterious disappearance of evidence in Sonny's criminal investigation. The weight of what Felicia brought Curtis wasn't just information, it was power. But wielding that power meant stepping into a war that would consume reputations, families, and even friendships. Jacinda's return would not be quiet, nor would it be safe. As Curtis looked into Felicia's eyes, he understood that everything from this point forward would demand sacrifice. But it also meant hope that the truth, once unleashed, could begin to heal what had been poisoned for far too long. In that moment, Curtis no longer stood as a passive observer to Drew's rise. With Jacinda, with Felicia's loyalty, and with the fire of justice burning in his chest, he was ready to bring the whole operation crashing down. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like the tide was finally turning. Lucas approached Carly with a quiet urgency that carried the weight of something far greater than familial concern. It was a call to action. The results of Natalia's autopsy had just surfaced, and although the full details had yet to be released to the public, Lucas, with his access to the hospital's inner workings, already knew that the preliminary findings were catastrophic for Sonny. Toxicology reports indicated the presence of a rare compound, one that could easily be manipulated to look like a naturally occurring sedative overdose, but which in reality had a precise chemical signature, one tied to controlled access within medical circles. It was the kind of clue that pointed directly to foul play, and more dangerously, could be used to frame Sonny in the worst possible light. Lucas, who had spent much of his career trying to stay out of the web of his family's criminal associations, found himself unable to stand by any longer. The autopsy didn't just reveal a medical mystery, it was the beginning of a larger setup. A narrative engineered to make Sonny the villain of a tragedy whose origins were still obscured. And Lucas, with his clinical eye and ethical compass, saw what others might not. Someone had planted this trail. Someone with a reason to make Sonny fall, and fall hard. So he went to Carly, the only person with both the power and the emotional investment to do something before it was too late. He laid out the facts, if the evidence was left unchallenged, if the narrative was allowed to fester in silence, Sonny could be indicted. Not just as a man who made a terrible mistake, but as a murderer. Lucas wasn't asking Carly to break the law, not yet, but he was imploring her to use her influence, her connections, and most of all, her instincts to uncover who was truly behind this. The clock was ticking. Sidwell, known now to be operating behind the scenes, had not only manipulated the narrative but may have planted evidence, bribed officials, and used Sonny's own people, perhaps even his newly appointed guards, to carry out the betrayal. Carly, already suspicious of the rapid decline in control Sonny had shown in recent weeks, now had confirmation that her instincts had been right. Lucas's plea wasn't driven by emotion alone. He knew the cost of silence. And he had seen firsthand how quickly public perception could be weaponized. With the media already hinting at Sonny's culpability, with the PCPD under pressure to act swiftly, and with Sidwell's influence spreading like poison through the veins of the justice system, Carly had little time to act. And Lucas made it clear. If she didn't move now, didn't start her own investigation, gather her own team, perhaps even reconnect with Jason or Anna, then Sonny would be buried beneath a verdict shaped not by truth but by carefully crafted lies. Carly listened, torn between fury, fear, and the sickening weight of déjà vu. She had seen this before, the way powerful men like Sidwell maneuvered in the shadows. The way they used perception as a weapon and buried good men under the weight of guilt they didn't earn. Lucas didn't need to say more. His message had landed. And the urgency in his voice told Carly everything she needed to know. If she didn't act, Sonny would lose everything. Not just his freedom, but his legacy, his family, and perhaps even his life. And this time, the storm was too calculated, too quiet, and far too deadly to ignore. Drew's warning to Willow to stay away from Michael's latest proposals was more than just advice. It was a sharp and calculated move in a game that had long since lost any boundaries of morality or emotional restraint. In the aftermath of their courtroom losses and the unraveling of alliances they once counted on, Drew began to see that Michael's descent into obsession was no longer just a personal issue, but a dangerous liability. The version of Michael now moving through Port Charles was no longer the golden son or the remorseful brother trying to rebuild what was lost. He was a man cornered, manipulative, and increasingly unpredictable. And that instability, Drew believed, could drag Willow down with it. When Drew confronted Willow, his tone carried a subtle urgency. He wasn't merely trying to protect her, he was protecting his plans. Michael had begun making overtures again, suggesting compromises in custody, hinting at shared arrangements, even implying he could rehabilitate his image and still be a part of their children's lives. To anyone else, it might sound like redemption. But to Drew, it sounded like the beginning of a power grab. He knew Michael too well, knew the way guilt morphed into control in his hands, how he used emotion as a weapon and regret as currency. Drew had once trusted Michael. But that trust was obliterated the moment Michael began operating outside the bounds of sanity and legal restraint, orchestrating manipulations, threatening family members, and turning his obsession with Willow into something almost territorial. Willow, still raw from losing custody and reeling from the public fallout of her courtroom outburst, was vulnerable, and Drew knew it. She wasn't just at risk of being pulled back into Michael's world emotionally, she was at risk of being used again, either as a shield, a pawn, or a distraction in Michael's wider war. Drew's warning was intended to draw a clear line, not just to protect Willow from emotional relapse, but to block Michael from regaining any psychological leverage. But underneath the surface, Drew's motivations were far more complex. He had invested so deeply in controlling the narrative surrounding Wiley and Amelia that losing Willow to Michael, even emotionally, would compromise everything. The warning also signaled something deeper, Drew's realization that the battlefield was shifting in dangerous ways. With Natalia's death still under investigation, with Sonny's empire beginning to fracture under the weight of betrayal and planted evidence, and with figures like Sidwell and Selena playing in the shadows, Drew saw that the game was no longer about family or custody, it was about survival. And Michael, unhinged and erratic, was quickly becoming a liability to anyone associated with him. Willow, for her part, remained caught in the undertow of emotional trauma. Her instincts were clouded, her sense of self-worth eroded by the courtroom humiliation and public shaming. Michael's words, though loaded with manipulation, still held enough emotional history to confuse her. Drew saw this. He saw her hesitation. He saw the way she flinched when Michael's name came up. Not from fear, but from unresolved guilt and longing. And that's what made his warning even more urgent. Willow had to be cut off from Michael completely, not only for her protection, but to ensure that Drew's control remained intact. As the days progressed and Michael's actions grew more erratic, trying to visit Wiley without clearance, leaving messages for Willow laced with nostalgia and veiled desperation, Drew doubled down. He began quietly removing Willow's access to legal resources Michael might exploit. He altered visitation agreements, reinforced security around Amelia, and even began working with individuals like Felicia and Curtis to anticipate Michael's next move. Because what was once a custody battle had transformed into a psychological war zone. And Drew understood one thing clearly now: if Willow slipped back into Michael's orbit, even slightly, all the power he had clawed back could collapse. The stakes had never been higher. The dangers had never been more unpredictable. And Michael, once the center of light in the Corinthos family, had become the dark storm threatening to undo them all.